Hello everyone, welcome to De-Roofing Dentistry. This is Dr. Khushali Arora, and in today's lecture we will be discussing tooth anatomy. It is one of the most important foundational topics in the dental anatomy. Now before we begin, I just want to mention that in the previous lecture we have already discussed the functions of teeth, types of teeth, tooth surfaces, and tooth numbering system. So if you haven't watched those videos yet, I would highly recommend watching them first because they'll make this topic much easier to understand. Now let's come to today's lecture. In today's lecture, we will focus more on the structure of tooth, crown and root, internal anatomy, tooth landmarks and morphological features. And trust me, this topic is extremely important because it forms the foundation of almost every clinical subject in dentistry. So let's begin. Tooth anatomy is the study of the external and internal structure of teeth. Every tooth has specific shape, structure, and a specific location in the mouth. Teeth together forms the dentition and are important structures of the oral cavity. Now let's discuss the basic parts of the tooth. So every tooth has a crown, a root, and a cervical region. The crown is the visible part of the tooth above the gingiva. So the part that you are able to see in the oral cavity is called the crown. It is covered by enamel. Now, there are two types of crown: anatomical crown and clinical crown. Anatomical crown is the part covered by enamel, and the clinical crown is the part visible in the mouth. This may change depending upon the gingival position. Okay. Now, the root is the part that is embedded in the alveolar bone. It is covered by cementum, and its function is it anchors the tooth, provides support, and transfers chewing force. To the bone. Now, different teeth have different roots. We have single rooted teeth and we have multiple rooted teeth. Examples of single rooted teeth are incisors, canines, and most of the premolars. Example of multi-rooted teeth is our molars. Okay, molars usually have 2 to 3 roots. Okay, now the cervical region. Cervical region is the area where the crown meets the root. Okay, it is also called the cemento-enamel junction, CEJ in short. CEJ because it is the region where the cementum, which is on the root of the tooth, meets the enamel of the crown. That is all about the basic structure of the tooth. Now let's see the internal anatomy of tooth. So, the tooth consists of enamel, dentin, pulp, and cementum. Okay, the enamel is the outer covering of the crown. It is the hardest substance in human body. It is highly mineralized. acellular, and it cannot be regenerated. Functions of enamel are: it protects the tooth from mechanical forces and wear and tear. Now, the layer under the enamel is our dentin. It is little bit yellowish in color. It is less harder than enamel, sensitive, and contains dentinal tubules. Okay, its function is supports enamel, protects pulp, and transmits stimuli. Then we have our pulp. Pulp is the soft vital tissue present in the center of the tooth. Contains blood vessels, nerves, and connective tissues. Functions of pulp are formative, nutritive, sensory, and defensive. The functions of the pulp are very important because this is asked as an MCQ in first year sessionals or the external exams. Then the cementum. The function of cementum is to provide attachment for periodontal ligament. So, the periodontal ligaments are present between the bone and the cementum, and they provides the attachment for the periodontal ligament. Okay, then we have our alveolar bone here. Okay, and periodontal ligament in between the bone and the cementum. Now, this was everything about the internal anatomy of the tooth. Now, let's move on to the landmarks. So, here we are going to discuss cusp, tubercle, cingulum, ridge, marginal ridge, triangular ridge, transverse ridge, oblique ridge, fossa, sulcus, developmental groove, supplemental groove, pit, and lobe. So we'll get into each of these one by one. Let's start with cusp. So a cusp is a pointed or rounded elevation present on the crown of a tooth. So the part here, the highlighted one that you are able to see is your cusp. Cusps are commonly seen in canines, premolars, and molars. Example: canines usually have one cusp, premolars 2 cusps, and molars 4 to 5 cusps. Okay. Then we have tubercle. A tubercle is a small rounded projection produced by extra enamel formation. It is smaller than a cusp. Example: like cusp of cerebelli that you will see on the maxillary first molar on the lingual surface. Okay, so this tubercle, that this small elevation that you are able to see here is the tubercle. Okay, now the third one is cingulum. A cingulum is a convex rounded elevation present on the cervical third of the lingual surface of the anterior teeth. So this, the prominent portion that you are able to see here on the lingual portion of the maxillary central incisor is your cingulum. Okay, it is most prominently seen in the maxillary canines, and it represents the lingual developmental lobe. Okay, now we can move on to the ridges. So we have 4 types of ridges: marginal ridge, triangular ridge, oblique ridge, and transverse ridge. Okay, we'll go one by one. So the marginal ridge is a linear elevation on the occlusal surface of the molars on the mesial and distal borders. Okay, and it is also present on the lingual surface of the anterior teeth. So now the triangular ridge. A triangular ridge descends from the tip of the cusp towards the central part of the occlusal surface. So as you can see, this is your tip of the cusp, and then the elevated part here in a triangular form is your triangular ridge. Okay, it is mainly seen in premolars and molars. Then now we have the oblique ridge. The oblique ridge crosses the occlusal surface diagonally. Okay, so as you can see here, we have elevation here, and then that elevation is going like this. Okay, so this is forming a ridge diagonally. Okay, and this ridge is most commonly seen in maxillary molars, especially maxillary first molars. Okay, then we have transverse ridge. So transverse ridge is most commonly seen in premolars, and when two triangular ridge join across the occlusal surface, they forms the transverse ridge. Okay, so this is what transverse ridge is. Now we are done with the ridges. Now we can move on to the fossas. So fossa is a shallow depression or concavity in the surface of the tooth. So a fossa is a shallow depression or concavity on the surface of the tooth. There are three types of fossas: lingual fossa, central fossa, and triangular fossa. So the lingual fossa is usually present on the lingual surface of the anteriors. Okay, then the central fossa. The central fossa is usually seen in the molars, and then we have the triangular fossa. This fossa is seen both in the molars as well as premolars. As you can see here, this concavity or the shallow depression here on the mesio-occlusal and disto-occlusal surface of the tooth is our triangular fossa. Okay, then we can move on to the sulcus now. A sulcus is a long valley-like depression. Sulcus is a long valley-like depression. Now, this valley that you are able to see here, long valley-like depression, is the sulcus. At the bottom of the sulcus, there is usually a groove. Okay, now we have two types of grooves: developmental groove and supplemental groove. Okay, a developmental groove is a linear depression that marks the junction between the developmental lobe. Example, the central groove. So the groove that you are able to see here, that is the central groove because it is in the center of the occlusal surface. Okay, then we have the buccal groove. So if suppose a groove, a depression passing from the occlusal surface to the buccal surface, that will be the buccal groove. Okay, then we have the supplemental groove. Supplemental grooves are small additional grooves that do not mark the developmental lobe. So As you can see, we have two cusps here, the buccal cusp and the lingual cusp. So these two are the developmental lobes. So the groove that marks the junction between the developmental lobes is the developmental groove, while the one that is additional and do not mark the developmental lobe is supplemental groove. Okay, they simply add supplemental anatomy to the tooth surface. Okay, then we have the pit. A pit is a small pinpoint depression. Now, here, the point where the sulcus or the developmental groove and the triangular fossa are meeting, there is a small pinpoint depression. There is a small pinpoint depression, and that is our pit. Okay. The common sites of a pit are central pit, which you'll find in the molars, and we have lingual pit. Lastly, lobe. A lobe is one of the primary sections of the tooth formation during development. Teeth develop from developmental lobes. Okay. Now important points about the lobe. Most anterior teeth develops from four lobes. Premolars develops from four lobes as well, and molars develops from 4 to 5 lobes. Okay, this is also an important MCQ question. On newly erupted incisors, you will find something like this, right? So these are called mamelons, and these mamelons represents the developmental lobes. Okay, so that was all about the tooth anatomy. So today we discussed about the tooth anatomy, crown and root, internal anatomy, enamel, dentin, cementum and pulp and their functions. Then we discussed about the landmarks such as cusp, tubercle, cingulum, ridges. We discussed four types of ridges: oblique ridge, transverse ridge, marginal ridge and triangular ridge. Okay, then we discussed about the fossas, sulcus, grooves, pits and lobes. Okay, so to conclude, tooth anatomy is the foundation of the dentistry. A strong understanding of tooth structure and landmarks help us understand occlusion, restorative procedures and clinical dentistry. Every dental subject in the future is built upon these anatomical basics. So master tooth anatomy thoroughly and revise it repeatedly with diagrams and tooth models. Thank you everyone for watching my video. If you liked my video, please do share my video and subscribe my channel. Thank you. Bye bye.